1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good.
Yes. We're on.
Okay. So I think everybody's here. Shall we start? Well, welcome everybody to this talk on the brave new world of SharePoint and Office 365 development. So if you're wondering about this picture here, this is actually Shakespeare's The Tempest, a little bit of culture to start us off this morning. It's a painting by Waterhouse, and this character is called Miranda, and she's led a very sheltered life on this island, and she's suddenly exposed to the world of real people, and this is a little bit what the situation of the SharePoint developer is in this world. We've had our little bubble of SharePoint development, and now we're kind of being exposed to the whole world of web development in the wider sense, and so it's a bit of a culture change for us. And so that's why I call this talk Welcome to the Brave New World, because that's where that phrase Brave New World comes from originally. It's also the title of a book by Aldous Huxley, which you might be aware of as well. So it's that's the background to this. That's just the reason why I chose this picture. Some people wonder what the significance of the shipwreck is. You know, does that represent SharePoint in this talk? Not at all. No. SharePoint is doing very well, and it's Office 365 is one of Microsoft's fastest growing products as well. So this is all relevant stuff. Who in the room is a SharePoint developer, or one, two? Who has done SharePoint development in the past? And yes, okay, a few, and the sort of yeah, kind of. So that's the kind of background. So I'll work through where we've been in SharePoint development and how we got to where we are today, and I hope that at the end of today you'll feel a bit more confident and encouraged to look at SharePoint and Office 365 as a development platform and use some of those skills. So my name is Bill Ayers. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master. I did the MCM course for SharePoint. That was 3 grueling weeks in Redmond. So starting at 8 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 8 o'clock at night. This won't be quite as intense as those days were. Even when we finished, we then carried on working, of course. That wasn't the end of the story. We had numerous exams which were very difficult to get through, so it was quite a tough course. You can't be an MCM anymore, unfortunately. That's no longer available, but you can get all these other qualifications, of which I have quite a number. I kind of started accumulating these certifications and awards, all starting with the letter M. So this isn't a complete set, this is a filtered list starting with the letter M. So you have to kind of move over to Microsoft technology if you've got that ambition. Anyway, there's my contact details if you'd like to get in touch with me later. By all means, follow me on Twitter or ping me an email, and I'll try, if I can, to answer your questions. But my background's really, I do consultancy and a little bit of training in Office 365 and SharePoint development. So, only got an hour, so I'm going to try and cover as much that I hope will be useful and make sense to people who are not primarily an existing SharePoint development audience. So I'll probably start with a little bit of a background of SharePoint to sort of put you in the picture. Then we're going to look at the history of SharePoint development and how we got to where we are with the SharePoint framework, which is the main topic of the talk. So what is SharePoint? And everybody has a different answer. I mean, even if it was a room of SharePoint developers, you probably wouldn't get a very clear answer either. It's kind of means different things to different people, and you know, some people think, well, it's a place to share files, which was kind of where the name of the tool came from. Some people say it's a site provisioning engine, meaning a website provisioning engine. That was kind of the original definition of it, except it can provision these very complicated sites which have a lot of business functionality. So it kind of grew into this very powerful intranet building application. Some people think, well, it's based on ASP.NET, so it's a kind of an ASP.NET application. but it's a very large one. It's a content management system. So Microsoft used to have a product called Microsoft Content Management Server, and they moved that functionality into SharePoint, and that became Microsoft's CMS offering for quite a long time. An intranet platform, of course, as well, and they've also extended it starting in about 2010 with a lot of extra features for enterprise content management, and it's kind of moved into the sort of the top quadrant for ECM systems. So it competes with products like Documentum, that specialize in enterprise content management and all the infrastructure around that. So it's many different things, and one of the things is it's got a lot of technologies built into one. So in many areas it's perhaps not the best solution for that compared to other things in the marketplace, but you kind of get everything in one package and you just got this one thing to install. And a lot of us think of it as a development platform, and people sort of say, well, one of the common questions is, well, why do you need to build on top of SharePoint? Wouldn't you just build an ASP.NET MVC application, for example? And the answer is really that SharePoint gives you a lot of things that save you a lot of time that you'd have to build yourself. A lot of people have tried to build a content management system using ASP.NET MVC, which you can do, of course, but the devil's in the details, and by the time you've figured out all these things that you need to make a successful CMS, it ends up being very time consuming and very expensive. So you probably want to buy some other or bring in some other content management system to do that. So that's kind of why we build on top of SharePoint, is it gives us all the infrastructure and the authentication layers and all of those things that we'd have to build out ourselves are already there, and we can build on top of it. And SharePoint scales out, so it's designed to scale, and it kind of manages the process of pushing things out into different web front-end servers for load balancing and for resilience as well. So you can build, large enterprises build these very complex farms to support their intranet with the teams of people managing all these servers and making sure that the right things are running in the right place. And there's a whole application server layer built into SharePoint to manage things that are cross-cutting across all the different aspects of the product. So it's a huge system. There's in terms of the hierarchy, there's a sort of probably just quickly open up this build, but you have these sort of site collections, and then under those this cascading hierarchy of sites, which a lot of organizations use to delegate permissions. So they'll have people managing things down that chain, and it becomes much more efficient to do that to support a very large user base and give different departments of the organization their own autonomy over the different parts of the intranet. And sadly, there are, over time we've accumulated little bits of backwards compatibility problems, like things aren't quite named right. So that on the development side, we call a site an SP web, which is these things down here, and then the site collection is called an SP site. So now things start to get a little bit confusing, and that's really just the beginning of the story. We have this nice model for pushing out server-side full trust code solutions on SharePoint with these SharePoint feature framework, and we can use that to build additional functionality, and a lot of people have done it internally. In some cases, they have quite large teams of developers building functionality on top of SharePoint, or ISVs will build products that are delivered in the same way. So there's a kind of an aftermarket of people building products on top of SharePoint. But it's that was the model that we used, and it kind of really was consolidated in 2007 with these farm solutions that are kind of automatically pushed out to all the websites. And it was a great way of delivering some functionality in a scalable fashion. But there were problems with it, and because it was full trust code running on the server, there's the possibility that if somebody makes a mistake, they could bring the whole server down, and that did happen quite frequently. People who write APIs, they have to make decisions about who's responsible for disposing of an object, for example, and it isn't always transparently clear whether the system is going to dispose of this object or you have to actually actively dispose of it in your .NET code. And so there are a lot of problems with memory leakage, where the garbage collector, because it's .NET, so it's managed code, but the garbage collector comes along and sees an object and says, okay, that's quite small, I can leave that, but actually underneath there's this huge COM object. And so we'd often find that if people weren't very careful about how they built these solutions, it could easily bring a farm down and bring the whole system down, and that was pretty bad. And certainly as Microsoft have moved to move things into the cloud and try to get us to use Office 365, they can't really allow people to run their own code in their servers in the farm any more than we'd expect Twitter or Facebook to let us run code on their servers. So for a few years now, Microsoft have been looking for another model for development that would protect against that. So the first approach was to use sandbox solutions, and they said, hey, look, don't build farm solutions anymore, don't build full trust code, you use this sandbox model where there's a kind of a protected execution environment. That didn't really take off. Then a bit later they came along and they said, well, let's have this SharePoint app model where we'll kind of get you, instead of running it on the server, you can run things client side. And that then changed its name to the SharePoint add-in model, adding slightly further confusion. And that was the approach that was kind of recommended and came in with SharePoint 2013. And now, and slightly embarrassing, because we've keep coming up with these new development models, we've got another approach called the SharePoint framework. And a lot of people have asked, is this yet another development model? Well, kind of it is in a way, and you'll notice I've left a bit of space in this slide so that just in case something else comes along later. But I do think this is now the way that we're going to do SharePoint development moving forward. So if you're new to SharePoint development, you're very fortunate because you don't have to look really so much at these older techniques. I would suggest that you concentrate on the SharePoint framework as the way of developing moving forwards. And it's all following this sort of devices and services model where we're kind of treating SharePoint and Office 365 as just another service that we're going to consume. So a lot of this depends on open standards and these building blocks. One of them is REST, which is kind of more of an approach to doing this kind of thing. It's the acronym isn't terribly helpful. Representational state transfer. I think it's probably a backronym, but it's using the. Everybody knows about REST, I presume, but it's using those HTTP verbs that were always there and have been there since the 1990s. Well, since the HTTP protocol was introduced, but we never kind of used them. We started building these very complicated SOAP and XML models on top of it. Suddenly somebody realized, hey, why don't we just go back to the rely on the transport level layer security and build on top of that. And that seems to have been an approach that's caught on. It's become very popular, and it's kind of open. There's another standard called the Open Data Protocol, OData, which is actually originally a Microsoft standard. It's now managed by an organization called Oasis, which was originally an XML managing organization. And then we've got another standard, OAuth, and if there's time I'll talk about it later today, this afternoon, to talk a little bit about OAuth as an authorization model. So these are all open standards and we can build these request URLs so at the very low level, and you can just do this in the browser. You can put one of these REST calls in that finds a resource and then returns something, and the OData bit is how we do the querying on it. So that's helped us really given us some much more open standards for developing with SharePoint, and just regarding SharePoint as something that we're going to consume. Now, there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the add-in model, which uses this approach, and that's really where we first got these endpoints. These REST endpoints were introduced really to support this add-in model. There are a couple of forms that this comes in. One is called the SharePoint hosted add-ins, where everything's running in a page, and the other one is called the cloud hosted or provider hosted add-ins, where we have to provide a web server using some other technology. So this isn't running, this is SharePoint, and this is some other technology that we're running. Typically, people normally from a Microsoft background, they would gravitate towards ASP.NET MVC. But you could use Node.js, which Ted is going to talk about later if you wanted to, or Ruby on Rails, you know, or heaven help us, PHP, you know, whatever technology you wanted to. And the idea is that this is going to use these REST calls to talk to our SharePoint backend. Now, there's quite a complicated bit of security setup that we've got to do to make this work. And one of the problems is, you know, even when you've got it working, if somebody starts changing firewall rules or something like that, this all kind of starts falling apart, and you have to sort of go back to square one and get it all working again. So a lot of people found that very complicated. There's a kind of a backdoor route where you can come back through the browser, and then you've now got all kinds of cross-domain issues. So that's to do with the browser restrictions on where you can make calls to, and you have to use various techniques to get around those as well. So a lot of people have struggled to get that working, and what a lot of people want to do is they want to customize. This is an older version of SharePoint, but they want to, the joke is this sort of picture that's became almost synonymous with a SharePoint site, and people didn't want their site to look like SharePoint. This has been the #1 requirement for SharePoint developers, is make this site not look like SharePoint. And so I think for a while some of the developers and program managers at Microsoft were kind of in denial, and they thought, well, why would you want to customize our beautiful SharePoint engine? Fact is, you know, it's like the corporate version of the selfie. People, you know, they want their intranet to look like their own business and have its own character. And so, you know, that's the #1 requirement, and so people have found other ways of achieving it without going to the full add-in model, and one of those is a technique that's sort of generically called JavaScript injection or script injection, which is a process of getting somehow some JavaScript running in my SharePoint page, and there are many techniques to do this. And then the JavaScript is going to do something like, it might make a call back to the SharePoint REST endpoints, or it might go and say change this div over here, and you know, I want to change the banner color, so I find the div and I change its color, or I add a bit of behavior over here and do things in the page. And that actually works reasonably well, but there's a few drawbacks. One is there's no real control over it, or management, or central management of it. And another problem is that you might come in on Monday morning, and if it's in Office 365, they might have changed the master page in the meantime, and so the div that you were trying to modify no longer exists anymore. So it's not a very robust model. It carries quite a bit of risk that you're depending on certain things being in the page. So that's been a problem as well. So Microsoft have come up with this new SharePoint framework development model. It's entirely client-side. It's only been around for a couple of years. Well, last year May was really when it became available for the first time. It was sort of talked about for about 6 months before that. It's using this authoring canvas in these modern pages. So in SharePoint you might have noticed that you get these more modern looking sort of Web 2.0 looking pages nowadays, and it's designed to work in those. It doesn't rely on iframes, which is one of the techniques that the previous model used, which gives all kinds of performance issues. It's the same model that's used by the SharePoint product team, which is a big departure for SharePoint development, because previously we kind of have a one set of developer tools. It wasn't quite the same as what the SharePoint team were using to build the product. That's no longer the case. And you can use any client-side framework. They've kind of embraced some of these modern development techniques, and particularly in JavaScript frameworks, of which there seem to be about several thousand options, but you can theoretically use any of those. The one that they use is actually React.js, which I think suits quite well to the sort of the web part model, which was the initial element that was available in this. They added recently a number of things not yet available in on-premises SharePoint, but for SharePoint Online, for application customizers. The names aren't very helpful, but these are to do with doing a bit of the same sort of thing, is make the look and feel of the page a bit different, and make a bit of corporate branding and that kind of thing. Ways of adding commands in there, but these are all a supported approach, so they're kind of, there's some sort of API contract that they're not going to change something, and then using this approach you can expect to continue working and not have any problems if they make changes to master pages and so forth. So that was all very good, but it was a huge shock to the SharePoint development community, because it was, hey, wait a minute, what's this open source toolchain you're talking about? So that was when we first started to download these tools, and they said, right, you're going to install Node, then you're going to need Gulp and Git and Yeoman, and everybody's sort of saying, well, what is Gulp and what is Git? Because people have been used to working in Visual Studio. Now there is a Visual Studio extension now that supports this as well, but this is the tool chain that the Microsoft team developing this are using, and so I think our best plan is to try and follow that ourselves for our development. Now, who already uses those tools in their development? Say, if you're a web developer, you'd be putting your hands up. If you're a .NET developer in Visual Studio, probably not so much. Interesting. And who uses Visual Studio Code as an editor? 1, 2, 3. Okay, 4. Yeah. And there's a piece missing from Visual Studio Code, because it's really a code editor, isn't it? You know, we have to say it's a code editor, not an IDE. I think that's so they don't offend the Visual Studio team. Do you sense a little bit of rivalry between these teams? So we have to have the Yeoman generator for the equivalent of file new project that we have in Visual Studio. So you start thinking, if you're a .NET developer, you're kind of trying to do a mapping between the different things in this new world and the old world. And you think, okay, yes, so okay, Git is my source code control system. Now, instead of using XAML, if I'm doing WPF development, I'm going to kind of just write in code in HTML. I'll probably use TypeScript. We'll talk about that in a minute, instead of C#. MS Build is the command line build engine that you never see because it's hidden behind the Visual Studio interface, is what we're going to use instead. We're going to replace that with Gulp, the JavaScript tool, the build tool. So I'll just do a little demo at this point, and how we're doing for time. So we finish at 12:15, isn't it? So yeah. So if I go to, probably the one website you definitely need to go to is dev.office.com. And if you scroll down here a little bit, you'll see SharePoint, and probably Learn More will be a good place to start. And there's probably down to SharePoint Framework, and that's not quite where I wanted to be. They've moved some of my stuff around. Hang on, I'm going to reorientate myself. So there's a bunch of, I'm going to try to find here, SharePoint Technologies, SharePoint Framework, and that's not quite the page that I used to get to when I clicked on that link.
Last week.
Yeah, I've got to reorientate myself. I had this open a second ago. Where have they put the... okay, getting started. No, not that one. Not that one. That's SharePoint add-ins. I don't want SharePoint add-ins. Right. SharePoint Framework. There should be a page anyway that gives you a set of probably under documentation, SharePoint Framework. That sounds more proper. That's where I wanted to be. So there's one here that's set up your development environment. That's probably the link you want to go to first. So that will list all the tools you need to install to get you started. It's actually not that difficult. So a lot of these tools are very quick to install. So it's not like the 2-hour Visual Studio install. You just Node.js, for example, a few minutes. Visual Studio Code, a few minutes to install. The same with Gulp. The one step that does take a while, which I'll show you, is when it brings in all the dependencies for the SharePoint framework. Yeoman doesn't take very long to install either. So that's, I would say, go to that page first, and set aside an hour or so to run through that and get everything set up. And you'll be able to do what I've did. I've already set this up already, of course. And then what we can do is there's another link which is here, web parts and get started, build your first web part. So just remember that link as well. So that is at the URL is a bit complicated, but if you follow these links down that I did, assuming they didn't move things around too much, and you'll see a set of instructions here which are build your first client-side web part, and again you can step through those and you can repeat the demo that I'm about to do. Again, it'll only take you sort of half an hour to get that up and running. One of the interesting things about this documentation is there's an edit link here, and the edit link takes you to GitHub. So whereas before Microsoft's documentation used to be hosted on MSDN, and if you saw a mistake you'd kind of email somebody, and then maybe sometime later, maybe 6 months later, an editor would come along and maybe fix the error. Here you can actually submit a pull request to GitHub, and they get things updated very quickly. So the whole of the SharePoint framework, not all of the SharePoint framework is open source, to be clear, but it could be at some point. It isn't at the moment, but this documentation is kind of open sourced, and it's, and all of the samples are also open source, so that you can contribute to them. A lot of people in the community are working on these, as well as people within Microsoft. So things are developing very rapidly. Much more rapid rate of change than we had in some of the technologies that Microsoft have had in the past. So it's kind of interesting to see this kind of different approach to maintaining the documentation and the software itself. So if I wanted to, I could go and edit this in GitHub. And in fact, if we go up to this top level SharePoint, there's a lot of there's code samples here that you can work through. And there's this library PNP.js core, which I'll look at if I get time a little bit later. That's a complete REST API wrapper library that they've built out to make it much easier to build these web parts or other JavaScript based development approaches. So what I've already set some of this up, so we'll have a look at that in a second. Let me just go back to the slides for a moment. I just step through some of those bits of tooling quickly. So Node.js, Ted is going to talk about later, right? No, Ted, in next session. So don't go anywhere. That's this morning, yes, before lunch.
I think it's after lunch.
Is it? After lunch, right. So straight after lunch, back here, we'll learn about Node.js if you don't already have that knowledge. Gulp is this build engine, so you can think of that as equivalent of MS Build or Make. That didn't sound too good, did it? Make in the Unix world, if you've used that. But it's the nice thing about Gulp is it uses JavaScript, so it's not declarative like some of these other tools like Grunt, for example. So you can kind of have some procedural code inside that process, but it's built on top of Node, so it's using Node in this case as a kind of development tool. I suppose Node's primary application is as a web server, but we're going to use it for that as well, but we use it as our sort of platform to run all these development tools off, which has an interesting consequence that it doesn't really matter now if you're using a Windows laptop, as I do, or a Macintosh, or even a Linux machine. You can do all this development using whatever technology you want to. Another kind of major departure from the Microsoft approach in the past, which is always, okay, you're going to use Visual Studio and probably use Windows as the platform. And for SharePoint development, we always used to have to provision a SharePoint site, which usually meant that we had to then run Windows Server and so do our development inside an instance of Windows Server in a VM or even just provision a Windows Server machine for development. So we don't have to do that anymore. We can do it all locally on our machine, and as we're going to see, we don't even need SharePoint running anywhere. We can do some development just locally. Git I would recommend installing as well. You strictly don't necessarily need it, but so Git is a distributed source control system. Who uses Git already? Loads of hands, right? Good. So that's the tool, and TFS now supports the Git protocol as well, so you're not forced to use something like Bitbucket, but you could use TFS, and GitHub is of course the one of several actually that support Git as a repository, like I suppose Codeplex would be an equivalent, and it's free for open source projects, so that's why we're seeing a lot of these things are appearing on GitHub. So Visual Studio Code, quite a few people, I think 3 or 4 people have been using that before, but it's a beautifully simple, lightweight editor, but it kind of a lot of its functionality is hidden behind, if you bring up this sort of command palette, you get a lot more functionality. What you don't have is a big ribbon along the top with lots of buttons on, as you do in Visual Studio, that kind of help you find the different features. You're going to kind of go digging around and looking for them, and maybe installing extra extensions to get what you want with Visual Studio Code. But that's, again, it's only a couple of minutes to install, so it's very quick install, very quick to start up relative to Visual Studio. So a lot of people are using Visual Studio as their editor, but you could carry on using Visual Studio Code as their editor, but you could use Visual Studio just as well. I mean, it's just just using it as an editor, but a lot of people are using code now. And then Yeoman, the scaffolding engine, which is really it's doing what File New Project does, which is it gives you the structure, the file structure of a new project ready to start work on. So we'll see all those working now. So if I go down into, and I've got a directory here called Office Dev, and if I Let's say we'll create a new directory under here, and I don't know what shall we call this? A new folder, and I'm going to call that SDN. I'll just go down to there, and the way I do it is I open a PowerShell window, and what I can do here is, because I've already installed these tools, I'm going to do yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. So this is a Yeoman generator that Microsoft have written for the SharePoint framework. We can't just do yo SharePoint because somebody somehow got hold of that, so it had to be sort of namespaced. So there's another one for Office. If you want to do Office, you're asking about Office add-ins. So there's one for Office add-ins as well, but that's yo Office, which looks better on a T-shirt than if it would. They made some T-shirts with yo SharePoint in, which is a really snappy T-shirt design, but it didn't work. So you have to type yo at Microsoft SharePoint, and then you get this nice bit of ASCII art, because ASCII art is the new cool thing, isn't it, in command lines? Because anybody remember when you used to have to use command lines to do development because that's all you had available before IDEs? And now we've kind of come full circle. So we'll take a default there. We'll use the current folder. Now I've got a choice between Node JavaScript Web Framework, React.js, and Knockout, the data binding library. A lot of people would sort of expect Angular to appear in this list. So there isn't, they don't have a built-in Angular one. I wouldn't be surprised if one appears. There is sample code for building with Angular if you're an Angular enthusiast. Personally, I like React, and that's what Microsoft are using, so it's kind of already loaded in the pages and so on. But for this one, we'll just use Node JavaScript framework. We'll give it a Hello World name because it's a Hello World web part, and it has already scaffolded out that project. This next step, which is going to take probably 10 minutes or something, depending on our internet speed, and I don't propose to wait for it to run because it's the one time-consuming step. What it's actually doing is it's using a tool which is part of Node.js, or within Node.js, which is the Node Package Manager, and it's using npm to fetch all the dependencies. This is something that kind of surprises people when they start using this for the first time. Is it kind of fans out into all these dependent libraries, and they depend on other libraries, and they're all open source, and it ends up with a huge amount of these libraries that it pulls in. And we kind of think that's strange because in Visual Studio what usually happens is when you do file new project, it'll go off to NuGet and start pulling in things, but it kind of does it silently in the background and we don't see it, so we don't think it's not quite so alarming. But some people were quite horrified by the amount of stuff that this brings down. It's just this chain of dependencies. Anyway, I'm going to Control C that, but and break that off. So if I let that run, it would eventually pull in all these dependencies. Now I can still go into Visual Studio Code, so let's start code in this location. So that's what the code dot does. So I've installed Visual Studio Code already, and so the beauty of the Visual Studio Code editor is it's actually built using the same technologies that we're going to use here. It's actually using it's called the Electron framework, which is a way of building an application using HTML and JavaScript. So which is kind of what we're going to be doing when we build one of these SharePoint framework projects. So you know, one of the funny things is it always amuses me that you can go and toggle the developer tools in here, and you kind of, if you're familiar with the Google tools, you know, you say, all right, okay, so oh yeah, so that's actually this thing here is it's actually an HTML5 element, and if I start looking at the code itself, so I'm going to open this one here, and if we want to look at something inside here, it's probably not the exact file I wanted, but if, these things themselves are, it's their HTML5 spans that it's using to build this very sophisticated user interface. So don't let anybody tell you that you can't build sophisticated client-side applications with JavaScript and HTML5, because clearly you can, and CSS. So Visual Studio Code itself built using these technologies. So if I go into, and I'm not going to do that later I think rather than right now, and if I go into here, you can see that I've got a render method, and if you did SharePoint development before, we had a render method in a web part. Actually, we used to override a render contents method, but this is the same kind of approach. But what it's doing is, if you look at, and this is in TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, it's going to take this .element.inner.html, so this is the HTML element that it's rendering this web part into, and it's just going to dump this chunk of HTML into it. There's a little bit of substitution here, so it's not a templating so much as it's this JavaScript backtick operator that allows you to do a little bit of substitution of values in here, but the bulk of it is just raw HTML5. Now, little sort of architecture side note, is that how you want to do your development, dumping HTML5 into a thing? Maybe not. Maybe you want to use a framework or something a bit more structured, like some sort of MVC model or MVVM or something like that. Probably. But for the purposes of the demonstration of just a simple, this is how it all works, this is an adequate way of creating one of these web parts. So we're going to generate HTML5 inside this web part when we eventually see it and run it. And that's in essence what we're doing. There's obviously quite a few libraries behind this making this all work, but now in order to demonstrate it, what I'm going to have to do is jump over to one that I did earlier. So I did one recently in Zagreb, so if I go to Zagreb, and take my word for it, this is pretty much identical, except I've let that npm install run to conclusion, so it's populated this node modules directory here with all these dependent things. And if I open that actually in have I still got Visual Studio Code open? Yeah, I have. If I open node modules, well, there's nothing in this one because already it had started. So the massive list of dependencies in these modules, all taken care of automatically. But so what I then do is I use this gulp command and say gulp serve, and this will build this web part. It'll do things like do TypeScript compilation, and there's a little bit of CSS compilation going on using Sass, which is a CSS preprocessor. And then I get this thing called the SharePoint Workbench. At first glance, you might think, looks like a SharePoint page. I'm on a SharePoint page, but it's a kind of fake, because if I go here, you see this waffle, the sorry, correct name, App Launcher, doesn't do anything. There's no user profile here. It's just a bit of markup to make it look a little bit like a SharePoint page. If you look at the URL, it's actually running in localhost and the secret port 4321, which is significant. That's kind of the well-known port that it's using for this. So it's just hitting a local node server, which is serving up this page, an HTML5 page, which has a bit of JavaScript behind it with the ability to simulate a SharePoint site. So one of the things we have in a SharePoint site is this canvas, which is, you'll see in some of the modern pages, and we can add this web part here. So that's what I'll do there, and that's the web part that we built. Now we're running inside this page, and we can do things like there's a property pane. So if you remember, in conventional old style SharePoint web parts, you had the property pane where you could set things, except this one's reactive. So as I'm typing, you can see it's coming up in the page. It's in the part. It's, you know, you can set it up so that they are non-reactive. There's a setting to prevent that behavior, because sometimes you don't want it to react to every key press in the web part property page. And so this is our, you know, and I can delete it, and I can add it again, and this is the just really for you to do some development and exercise the web part. Interesting thing is you can get it to do a mobile view. I quite like this, because if I go inside here and edit that, I get another mobile view. See, I can go on. This is the kind of thing that pleases me, because you can have mobile views within mobile views within mobile views. But it's not very useful to do that. But you can. And so we have to do it for fun. So that's that's sort of the process of creating one of these web parts. Now I can also run it against an actual tenant. So if I go to let's say I've got a tenant at so I'll go to portal.office.com, and I might have already, yeah, if I log into this one, and I happen to know what the password is for this particular tenant that I set up as a little test tenant. And if I go to pretty much any tenant, go to this SharePoint kind of root site, SharePoint site, and I can just hack this URL. I don't know of an easier way of doing this, but there might be one, but I haven't found it yet. And I just say workbench.aspx. I have a similar thing that I had before. It's still kind of, I can render stuff in here. Now it knows, because this is kind of interesting, because remember I've still got, this is my PowerShell window. I've still got, it could be any command window that you would work the same, and I've still got the gulp serve running in there. So if I go back to here, I can now render that web part. But you see, I see a lot more web parts now, because this is in a real site, and I can go down and I should see my Hello World web part again. So that's, I can still run it in here, but now it's running against an actual SharePoint site. So if I was using a list, say, or something like that, it would get actual data from the site. All right, so spent quite a lot of time talking about that, so I think I'm going to jump out of here and go back to my slide deck and just kind of recap that if you're not a serious JavaScript developer, and the weird thing is I found that I've been doing JavaScript development longer than I've been doing C# development, because JavaScript came out in 96, 95, 96. The poor guy, Brendan Ike, who wrote this, he only spent about a fortnight writing JavaScript. It's a miracle, really, that it's good as it is. Everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people hate JavaScript, because their experience of JavaScript is adding some bit of code into a page and it didn't quite work, because really it wasn't JavaScript's problem, it was the DOM implementation was inconsistent between different browsers, and so they got frustrated. They kind of think of JavaScript in a slightly negative way. I think it's actually a beautifully written language. It has many good parts, as are explained in this book by Douglas Crockford, which is excellent. It's only about this thick, very nice read if you haven't done that so far. There's also a few bad parts as well. They made some big mistakes in the design of the language, the most egregious of which was to dump everything into the global namespace. So this gives us all kinds of problems with JavaScript development, where we pull in other people's libraries and we get these name conflicts. So there's a few serious mistakes in the design of JavaScript. It's kind of functional a bit. The functions are certainly first-class citizens in the JavaScript world. It uses prototypal inheritance, not classical inheritance models. So it's object-orientated, but not in the way we know it if we're a C# developer or a C++ developer or a Java developer. And we see the curly braces and we think it's the same kind of thing, but it's not. It's fundamentally different. Now, I noticed in the couple of rooms down, they're talking about, or we're talking about ECMAScript 7, which is one of the newer standards for JavaScript. So ECMAScript is like the umbrella standard for the language of which JavaScript is an implementation. And that now has classes and typing, but it's not, there isn't broad browser support, even for ECMAScript 6. We're kind of stuck with ECMAScript 5 for the time being. So this is why we have TypeScript as kind of a bridge to get us into the kind of ECMAScript 5 real implementations. We can compile, we can build using a sort of much more modern JavaScript, and then build down to versions that are supported on browsers. So that's why we use TypeScript. So that language was written by Anders Heilsberg, who is also behind C# and Delphi as well. So he's behind this. I think he spends most of his time on TypeScript now rather than C#, although I'm sure he's still on all the committees and things for C#. So that brings things like strong typing, which is very helpful for the development when you're doing sort of enterprise level development. You want a bit more control and a bit more assurance. I find it very useful. You know, when you're cycling around, you can pick up typos and things and make it a lot more efficient. There are other things like Office UI Fabric, which is a kind of a I hate to say responsive framework. It's not Bootstrap. It's specifically for giving Office applications, like Office add-ins, the right look and feel, and we've kind of adopted that same UI with SharePoint. So Office UI Fabric is a quick way to get all that working, and there are React components for that as well, which make that very good. This PnP.js core library is worth looking at, so I would strongly recommend you look at that. It's at github.com SharePoint. We looked at it briefly. So we can bring all of those techniques together and build something. So I've got a shopping list web part that I can now I must remember to stop this one, so we'll stop that. I'm going to go up a level, cd spfx shopping list, and I'll do a gulp serve in here. And this one is, before I do that, let me do code dot open Visual Studio Code, and now I'm going to do gulp serve. You sense that I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm speeding up a little bit. And then in this one, this shopping list web part, I've actually got a slightly different implementation. So when I originally went through the steps of setting this up, instead of going down the no JavaScript framework route, which I did for the Hello World one, I went down the React route. So now when this one starts up, the render method, instead of putting HTML into the element, it actually maps the DOM element to a oh, it started up already. That's quite good of it. I wasn't quite ready to show that. It maps this React element to the DOM element that corresponds to the web part, and so I have to go down into this components here, and then down in there there's a TSX file, and this is got the weird, if you've looked at React before and maybe the first time you think, oh, that's strange, it's kind of returning, where's the quotation mark gone? Oh, right, what's happening here? Well, there's a compiler going through and creating these React calls. So actually this is all JavaScript, although it looks like markup. This is what's going to generate, using the React framework, all the markup that will actually eventually be seen on the page. And I got a few techniques here. So I'm using the Office UI Fabric React components, so I'm actually instantiating, as well as HTML5 elements, I've got some of these React components in here as well. So it's a component-based model in React. Can't go into React right now in depth, but that's what's going on. And then I'm using this PNP.js library to call the JavaScript, to call the REST endpoint for SharePoint. But I've also got a test here because I can see whether I'm running locally or not, and kind of put mock data in here, which is what this bit of code is doing. Although there are dozens of ways of doing this and far more elegant, this is really for a demonstration. So when I run that web part, which I'm doing gulp serve here, we can add this shopping list web part. So this is running locally, and it's got all kinds of behavior coming from those React components. So I can, I've got a help panel that slides in, and it's got the sort of Office look and feel, and the right fonts and the right icon set and things, these fairly complex components that do things like menus. And I can add a new one, and I've got spinners going on to show what's happening. And if I run that one in the workbench, and if I refresh this page, it should pick it up. Because remember, whatever I'm running in gulp serve locally, I can see in this workbench page. So I should see the shopping list web part in here. And so if I add that, and now that's actually taking, I've actually got a SharePoint list in this site that it's actually populating that with. So it's gone off to the actual SharePoint list. So I can test it against SharePoint data. Eventually, I'll go through the steps to deploy that into here, which is there's a few more steps to that, but that's all explained in that documentation I showed you. But I don't really have time to go through it now. So that's, I kind of bringing those various bits of technology together to do that. So really, just to sum up, we've got this, opportunity now to reuse our JavaScript skills, which we've probably done. If we're doing a lot of web development, we're probably already fairly familiar with JavaScript, and we can use this to build user experiences in SharePoint with these web parts and these customizations. We can also build Office add-ins. We can build websites. We can build single page applications, and write web servers in JavaScript. So it's one technology that we can now use everywhere if we choose to. And this sort of whole approach that Microsoft's taking using open source tooling, I think, is really interesting, because it's a massive change of direction compared to, say, 10 years ago. You couldn't really imagine Microsoft saying, oh, let's build this out using Gulp and Node, and it would have been, we have to use Visual Studio and MS Build. This is a new way of doing things, although you can still use Visual Studio if you want to, or Notepad if that's your preferred code editor, or Vi if you're a Unix person. So it's this is a new model, with the exception of that sandbox model that I talked about before, which isn't available for in some forms for various reasons. All the old ways of doing things are still supported. It isn't replaced, but it gives us an opportunity for something moving forward. And I think this is the way that SharePoint development will go in the future. And I think it fits well now with the sort of mainstream of web development technologies, and we kind of rejoin the real world, and we've come off our island of SharePoint development. So dev.office.com is the easiest starting point to remember for setting all these things up. And as I say, if you've got a spare hour, have a go yourself and try it out and have fun. So thank you very much indeed. I hope that was useful. There's some resources, dev.office.com, or just go to Google. And I don't know if we've got time for any questions, or should we go straight to lunch? What do you think? If anybody got any questions, and we'll try and answer them. Everybody's hungry, right? Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. Hope it was useful. Thank you.